In a world where every royal movement is scrutinized by millions of cameras, how did the most powerful gesture of grief go completely unnoticed? Sometimes the smallest actions carry the heaviest hearts, and sometimes those who guard our most precious traditions are the ones who understand loss the most deeply. The morning of September 8, 2022 started like any other day at Buckingham Palace, but it would end as one of the most significant days in modern British history. Guard Captain James Morrison had been awake since 4:30 a.m., following his usual routine that had become second nature over his 12 years of service. The crisp autumn air carried a different feeling that morning, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Little did he know that in a few hours his world and the world of millions around the globe would change forever. James had always been meticulous about his appearance. Every button polished to perfection, every crease in his uniform sharp enough to cut paper, and his famous bearskin hat positioned exactly as regulations demanded. But today, something felt different. As he adjusted his chinstrap in the mirror of the guard's quarters, he caught his own reflection staring back at him with an expression he didn't recognize. There was a weight in his eyes, a premonition that seemed to settle deep in his chest. The palace grounds were unusually quiet for a Thursday morning. Normally, there would be the bustling sounds of staff preparing for the day's activities, tourists gathering outside the gates, and the general hum of London life filtering through the ancient walls. But today, even the birds seemed to be holding their breath. James stepped out into the courtyard, his military boots creating a rhythmic echo against the cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of British history. As he took his position at the entrance to the palace, James noticed several staff members huddled in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Their faces carried expressions of concern that immediately put him on alert. In his years of service, he had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when something was amiss, the way the head butler's shoulders were slightly more tense than usual, how the senior staff moved with a particular urgency, and most telling of all, the way everyone seemed to be checking their phones more frequently than protocol typically allowed. The first official indication that something was wrong came at approximately 10:15 a.m. when James received a coded message through his radio. Operation London Bridge may be in effect. All units maintain highest alert status. Operation London Bridge was the code name they had all been briefed on but secretly hoped they would never have to implement. It was the protocol for when the Queen passed away, a contingency plan that had been refined and updated countless times, but always felt like something theoretical, something that belonged to a distant future. James felt his heart skip a beat as the weight of those words settled in. Queen Elizabeth II had been a constant in his life, just as she had been for millions of others. She wasn't just his sovereign. She was the reason he had chosen this career path. As a young boy growing up in Yorkshire, he had watched her Christmas broadcasts with his grandmother, who had served in the Women's Royal Navy service during World War II. His grandmother would always stand during the national anthem, even when watching from her living room, and she had instilled in James a deep respect for duty, service, and the crown. The hours that followed were a blur of controlled chaos. Staff members moved with practiced efficiency, implementing protocols that had been rehearsed but never executed for real. James maintained his position, but internally, he was grappling with a mixture of professional duty and personal grief that he wasn't prepared for. The Queen had visited his regiment several times during his service, and each encounter had left a lasting impression. She had a way of making each soldier feel seen and valued, despite the formal nature of these interactions. Around midday, the confirmation came through official channels. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had passed away peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. The news hit James like a physical blow, even though he had been preparing for it all morning. He had spent years guarding the woman who had dedicated her entire life to serving others, and now she was gone. The weight of that loss was almost unbearable, but his training kicked in, and he maintained his composure. What followed was perhaps the most challenging afternoon of his career. As news of the Queen's death spread around the world, crowds began gathering outside the palace. The initial trickle of people became a steady stream, then a river, and finally a flood of humanity, all seeking to be close to the place that represented the monarchy they had just lost. James watched as people of all ages, backgrounds, and nationalities came to pay their respects. Many were crying openly, others stood in stunned silence, and some brought flowers that they placed carefully against the palace gates. The media descended like a swarm of locusts, their cameras capturing every angle, every emotion, every tear shed by the grieving public. Reporters from around the world broadcast live from the palace grounds, describing the scene to audiences across the globe. But in all of their coverage, in all of their analysis and commentary, they missed the most poignant moment of grief displayed that day. As the afternoon wore on, James found himself thinking about his grandmother, who had passed away 3 years earlier. She had always told him that service to the crown was the highest honor a person could have, and that protecting the Queen was protecting the very essence of what it meant to be British. Now, as he stood guard during the first hours after her death, he felt a profound connection to every guard who had served before him, and every guard who would serve after him. The public's grief was palpable and overwhelming. James had witnessed many emotional moments during his service, but nothing had prepared him for the raw outpouring of love and sorrow that surrounded him that day. Children who barely understood what was happening clung to their parents' hands while asking why everyone was crying. Elderly people who had lived through the Queen's entire reign stood with tears streaming down their faces, mourning not just a monarch but the end of an era. As evening approached, the crowds continued to grow. The flowers piled up against the gates had created a sea of color that stretched as far as the eye could see. Candles began to appear as darkness fell, creating a gentle glow that seemed to honor the Queen's memory in the most beautiful way. James had been on duty for nearly 12 hours, but the thought of leaving his post never crossed his mind. This was where he needed to be, where his training and his heart told him he belonged. The palace staff worked tirelessly to accommodate the crowds, while maintaining security and dignity. James coordinated with his fellow guards and security personnel to ensure that people could pay their respects safely while keeping the palace secure. It was a delicate balance, but one that they managed with the professionalism that had been instilled in them through years of training and service. Throughout the evening, James observed countless individual moments of grief and remembrance. He saw a young soldier, still in uniform, standing at attention while tears ran down his cheeks. He watched as an elderly woman placed a single white rose among the thousands of other flowers, her hands shaking as she whispered a prayer. These moments reminded him why his service mattered and why the Queen's life had touched so many people in such profound ways. As his shift finally came to an end near midnight, James walked slowly back toward the guards' quarters. The events of the day had changed something fundamental inside him. He had always taken pride in his service, but now he understood on a deeper level what it truly meant to be a guardian of something larger than himself. The Queen was gone, but the institution she represented would continue, and he would continue to serve it with everything he had. That night, alone in his quarters, James allowed himself to grieve privately for the woman who had been the cornerstone of his professional life and the inspiration for his service. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and eventually, the elaborate ceremonies that would mark the end of one reign and the beginning of another. But tonight, he mourned for Elizabeth II, the Queen, the woman, and the symbol of an era that had just come to an end. The media had captured every tear shed by the public, every flower placed at the gates, and every word spoken by officials and commentators, but they had missed the quiet grief of those who had dedicated their lives to protecting her. James fell asleep that night knowing that his mourning, while unseen by the cameras, was no less real or meaningful than the public displays of sorrow that had dominated the news coverage. Sometimes the deepest grief is the kind that goes unnoticed, carried silently by those who understood their duty was to serve, not to be seen. The next morning brought no relief from the emotional weight that had settled over the palace like a heavy blanket. James Morrison woke before his alarm, having slept fitfully through dreams filled with memories of the Queen's visits to his regiment. The silence in the guards' quarters was different now, charged with a grief that none of them had been trained to handle despite all their preparation. This wasn't about protocol or procedure anymore. It was about processing the loss of someone who had been the constant North Star of their professional lives. As James prepared for what he knew would be another emotionally charged day, He noticed that his fellow guards were moving with a different energy. Their usual morning banter was replaced by quiet nods and meaningful looks. Everyone understood that they were no longer just ceremonial guards. They had become the silent sentinels of a nation's grief. The weight of that responsibility was both humbling and overwhelming. The transformation of London had happened overnight. As James walked through the palace grounds toward his duty station, he could see that the crowds from the previous evening had not dispersed but had actually grown larger. People had camped out on the streets, determined to be as close as possible to the palace during this historic time. The sea of flowers had expanded exponentially, creating a carpet of color that stretched for blocks in every direction. But it wasn't just the flowers that struck him. It was the absolute silence of the crowd. Thousands of people stood quietly, many with their heads bowed in prayer or contemplation. Children sat on their parents' shoulders, sensing the solemnity of the moment even if they couldn't fully understand it. James had never witnessed anything like it in all his years of service. The usual sounds of London traffic seemed muted, as if the entire city was holding its breath out of respect. The media presence had intensified overnight as well. Satellite trucks lined the streets, and reporters from every major news organization in the world had set up their equipment to provide continuous coverage. James could see cameras positioned at every angle, capturing every detail of the public's vigil. News anchors spoke in hushed, reverential tones as they described the scene to viewers around the globe. But despite all this coverage, James noticed that the cameras consistently focused on the crowds, the flowers, and the palace itself, rarely lingering on the guards who stood as silent witnesses to it all. As he took his position at the palace entrance, James reflected on how his role had evolved overnight. Yesterday, he had been a ceremonial guard, part of a tradition that tourists photographed and visitors found charming. Today, he was a guardian of something much more profound. He was protecting not just a building or an institution, but the space where a nation was coming to terms with loss. Every person who approached the palace gates was seeking something different: closure, connection, or simply a way to express their grief, and James felt the responsibility of honoring that need. The morning passed slowly, each hour marked by waves of new visitors who came to pay their respects. James observed a remarkable cross-section of humanity during those hours. He saw diplomats and foreign dignitaries arriving in official cars, their faces grave with the weight of international relations that would now shift with the Queen's passing. He watched as ordinary citizens traveled from across the country, some arriving on buses they had chartered specifically for this purpose, others having driven through the night to be here. One moment that particularly moved James occurred around mid-morning when an elderly war veteran in a wheelchair was brought to the front of the crowd by his family. The man was wearing his military medals, and when he was positioned directly in front of where James stood, he struggled to raise his hand in a final salute to his queen. James could see the tremendous effort it took for the veteran to maintain that salute, his arm trembling with age and emotion, without breaking protocol. James subtly adjusted his own posture and acknowledgement, a silent communication between two soldiers who understood service and sacrifice. Throughout the day, James noticed that people weren't just grieving for the Queen, they were grappling with the end of an era. Many of the elderly visitors had never known a world without Queen Elizabeth II. She had been crowned when they were children, and her reign had been the backdrop for their entire lives. For them, her death represented not just the loss of a monarch, but the closing of a chapter in their own personal histories. James could see this realization in their faces as they stood before the palace, some weeping openly, while others stood in stunned silence. The younger visitors brought a different energy to the vigil. Many of them had never fully appreciated the Queen's significance during her lifetime, but her death had awakened in them a sense of connection to British history and tradition that they hadn't known they possessed. James watched as teenagers took selfies with the flower displays, not out of disrespect, but as a way of documenting their presence during this historic moment. Their grief was different but no less genuine than that of older generations. As afternoon transitioned to evening, James began to notice subtle changes in the crowd's behavior. The initial shock was beginning to give way to a more organized form of mourning. People were creating impromptu shrines within the larger display of flowers, carefully arranging photographs of the Queen alongside personal mementos and handwritten messages. Some had brought copies of newspapers from significant moments in the Queen's reign, while others had family photos that included meetings with the Queen during her various public engagements. The international response was becoming more visible as well. James could see people carrying flags from Commonwealth countries, and he overheard conversations in dozens of different languages. The Queen's death was not just a British loss. It was being felt around the world by people whose countries had been touched by her reign. This global outpouring of grief added another layer of complexity to James's role as a guardian. He wasn't just protecting a British institution, he was safeguarding a space that had become a focal point for international mourning. As his second day of service during this crisis drew to a close, James found himself thinking about the future. King Charles III would soon be crowned, and the monarchy would continue, but everything would be different. The guards would continue their duties. The protocols would remain largely the same, but the person they were protecting and the institution they represented would be forever changed. James wondered what it would be like to serve under a new monarch, to adjust his loyalty and dedication to someone who, while prepared for this role his entire life, would inevitably bring a different energy and approach to the crown. The night shift brought new challenges and new observations. The crowds didn't disperse as evening fell. Instead, they seemed to settle in for an extended vigil. Candles appeared throughout the crowd, creating a gentle flickering light that made the entire scene feel almost sacred. James had never experienced anything quite like it. The palace, which during normal times was simply his workplace, had been transformed into something resembling a cathedral, with thousands of people gathering to pay their respects and find comfort in shared grief. Throughout the evening, James witnessed countless individual acts of kindness and connection among strangers. People shared tissues, offered comfort to those who were crying, and made room for newcomers who wanted to add their flowers to the growing memorial. There was an unspoken understanding that everyone present was experiencing something profound together, and that understanding created bonds between people who would likely never see each other again. The media coverage continued around the clock, with reporters providing live updates every few minutes. James could see the bright lights of television cameras illuminating different sections of the crowd, and he could hear the constant murmur of commentary being broadcast to audiences around the world. But despite all this attention, he noticed that the coverage remained focused on the public's reaction and the official responses from government officials. The guards, despite being visible in every shot, remained largely invisible in terms of commentary and analysis. This invisibility didn't bother James. In fact, it felt appropriate. His job had always been to serve without seeking attention, to be a steady, reliable presence that people could count on without necessarily thinking about. But as he stood through his second night of this unprecedented vigil, he began to understand that his role had evolved into something more significant than he had initially realized. He wasn't just guarding a building, he was helping to hold space for a nation's grief. As the night wore on and the crowds began to thin slightly, James had time to reflect more deeply on what he had witnessed over the past 2 days. He had seen the very best of humanity on display: compassion, respect, shared sorrow, and an almost instinctive understanding of how to behave in the presence of something sacred. People from all walks of life had come together in a way that transcended their differences, united by their shared loss and their desire to honor the Queen's memory. When his shift finally ended in the early hours of the morning, James walked back to the guards' quarters with a profound sense of having witnessed history. He knew that the next few days would bring even greater challenges as the formal ceremonies began, and the world's attention focused even more intensely on the palace and its surroundings. But he also knew that he and his fellow guards were ready for whatever lay ahead, strengthened by the knowledge that their service was providing comfort and stability to millions of people who were struggling to process an unimaginable loss. The third day after the Queen's passing marked a turning point in both the public's mourning process and James Morrison's understanding of his role during this historic period. The initial shock was beginning to evolve into something more structured and purposeful, as officials announced the detailed plans for the Queen's lying-in state and funeral arrangements. For James, this meant that his duties would soon expand beyond his current post at Buckingham Palace to include participation in some of the most significant ceremonial events in modern British history. The morning briefing was unlike any James had attended in his 12 years of service. Senior officers outlined the complex logistics that would be required over the next several days, including the transportation of the Queen's coffin from Scotland to London, the lying in state at Westminster Hall, and ultimately the state funeral at Westminster Abbey. Each guard would play a crucial role in these proceedings, and the weight of that responsibility was evident in every face around the briefing room. As James listened to the detailed protocols, he was struck by the realization that these ceremonies weren't just about honoring the Queen. They were about providing a framework for the entire nation to process their grief. Every element had been carefully planned to allow maximum participation while maintaining the dignity and security that such occasions demanded. His role as a guard would be to help facilitate this national moment of closure, while ensuring that everything proceeded smoothly and safely. The crowds outside the palace had reached unprecedented levels by the third day. James estimated that there were well over 10,000 people gathered in the immediate vicinity, with many more streaming in continuously throughout the day. The logistics of managing such a massive gathering, while allowing people to pay their respects, had become a significant challenge. Police barriers had been erected to create orderly queues, and volunteers had appeared to help direct traffic and provide information to visitors. What struck James most profoundly was the diversity of the crowd. He saw families who had traveled from Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland specifically to be at the palace during this time. There were Commonwealth citizens who had flown in from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. International visitors were also present in large numbers, many of them expressing surprise at the depth of emotion they felt despite not being British subjects. The Queen's death had clearly resonated far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. During his afternoon shift, James witnessed several moments that would stay with him forever. A group of elderly ladies, all wearing their finest hats and dresses, had traveled together from a small village in the Cotswolds. They had known each other for decades and had shared memories of the Queen's coronation, which they had watched as young women. As they stood before the palace gates, they began quietly singing "God Save the Queen," their voices wavering with emotion but strong with conviction. Other members of the crowd gradually joined in, creating a spontaneous choir of thousands that sent chills down James's spine. Later that same afternoon, he observed a young mother explaining to her 5-year-old daughter why everyone was so sad. The child had brought a drawing she had made of the Queen, complete with crown and royal robes rendered in colorful crayon. When they reached the front of the crowd, the little girl carefully placed her artwork among the professional flower arrangements, and James watched as several news photographers captured the moment. It was a simple gesture, but it perfectly encapsulated the way the Queen's death had affected people of all ages. The media coverage had evolved as well, becoming more comprehensive and nuanced, as reporters had time to process the significance of what they were witnessing. James noticed that international news crews were now conducting interviews with people in the crowd, capturing personal stories about what the Queen had meant to individuals from around the world. These interviews revealed the remarkable reach of her influence and the personal connections people felt to her despite never having met her. However, James also became increasingly aware of what the media was not capturing. The cameras focused on the dramatic moments, the tears, the flowers, and the official proceedings, but they seemed to miss the quiet acts of service that were happening all around them. The palace staff who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, the security personnel who ensured everyone's safety, and the guards who maintained their posts through long hours of emotionally charged duty were largely invisible in the coverage. This invisibility extended to the small, personal moments of grief that James was privileged to witness. He saw fellow guards struggling with their own emotions while maintaining professional composure. During brief breaks, he noticed colleagues stepping away to collect themselves, some wiping away tears they thought no one could see. The guards were not immune to the grief surrounding them. They were simply trained to process it differently and to channel it into their service. One particular interaction that deeply affected James occurred during the evening shift. An elderly gentleman approached the palace gates carrying what appeared to be a military medal in a small presentation box. The man was dressed formally despite the late hour and moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to military discipline. As he placed the medal among the flowers, James could see that it was a Distinguished Service Cross, one of Britain's highest military honors. The elderly man stood at attention for several minutes, and James realized he was conducting his own private ceremony of respect. When the man finally turned to leave, he caught James's eye and offered a subtle nod, a recognition between two individuals who understood duty, service, and sacrifice. It was a moment of connection that transcended their different roles and generations, united by their shared commitment to something larger than themselves. As the third day drew to a close, James began to understand that he was experiencing something that would define not only his career, but his understanding of what it meant to serve others. The Queen's death had revealed the profound impact that dedicated service could have on people's lives. Through her decades of commitment to duty, she had become a source of stability and continuity for millions of people, and her death had created a void that was being filled, temporarily, by the collective grief and love of those she had served. The announcement came that evening that the Queen's coffin would arrive in London the following day, beginning the formal lying-in state period. This meant that James and his fellow guards would soon be taking on new responsibilities, including the honor of standing vigil beside the Queen's coffin, as hundreds of thousands of people filed past to pay their respects. The thought of this duty was both daunting and deeply meaningful. That night, as James prepared for what he knew would be even more challenging days ahead, he reflected on how his perception of his role had changed. 3 days ago, he had seen himself primarily as a ceremonial guard, an important but relatively straightforward position. Now, he understood that he was part of something much more significant, a living bridge between the monarchy and the people, a guardian not just of buildings and traditions, but of the very process by which a nation mourns and heals. The guards' quarters were quieter than usual that evening, but it wasn't the silence of depression or defeat. It was the quiet of men and women who understood the gravity of their responsibilities and were preparing themselves mentally and emotionally for the challenges ahead. James could sense the determination in his colleagues, the same resolve that had carried the Queen through decades of service, and would now carry them through this final act of duty to her memory. As he finally fell asleep that third night, James was aware that the most difficult and meaningful days of his career lay ahead. The world would be watching as Britain said goodbye to its longest reigning monarch, and he would be part of the ceremony that provided structure and dignity to that farewell. It was a responsibility that he had never imagined when he first put on his uniform, but it was one that he now embraced with the full weight of his training, his dedication, and his love for the institution he had sworn to protect. The media would continue to focus on the grand gestures and the public displays of grief, but James knew that the real story was also being told in the quiet moments, the subtle exchanges, and the unspoken understanding between those who had dedicated their lives to service. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to honor the Queen's memory through devoted duty, and James was ready to meet them with everything he had to give. The fourth day brought with it the weight of finality and the approaching culmination of a lifetime of service, both the Queen's and James Morrison's own. As he prepared for what would be one of the most significant days in modern royal history, James could feel the shift in energy throughout the palace. Today, the Queen's coffin would begin its final journey through London, and he would be among the guards selected to participate in the ceremonial processions that would mark this historic transition. The selection for ceremonial duties was based on experience, conduct record, and the ability to maintain composure under extraordinary pressure. James had been chosen to be part of the guard contingent that would accompany the Queen's coffin during portions of its journey, an honor that filled him with both pride and an almost overwhelming sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about following protocol. It was about providing the final escort for a woman who had dedicated her entire adult life to serving others. The early morning briefing was conducted with military precision, but James could detect the underlying emotion in his commanding officer's voice. Everyone understood that they were about to participate in events that would be remembered for generations. The detailed timeline was reviewed multiple times, with every movement and position carefully planned to ensure both dignity and security. James memorized his specific responsibilities, knowing that there would be no room for error when the world's attention was focused so intensely on every detail. As the morning progressed, James took his position along the ceremonial route that the Queen's coffin would follow. The crowds had grown to unprecedented proportions, with estimates suggesting that over 1 million people had gathered along the various routes through London. The atmosphere was different from the previous days, still respectful and mournful, but now charged with anticipation as people prepared to witness history. Standing at attention along the route, James had a unique vantage point to observe the crowd's behavior as they waited for the procession to begin. What struck him most was the absolute silence that fell over the massive gathering as the appointed time approached. Conversations stopped, children were quieted, and even the ambient sounds of the city seemed to fade away. It was as if the entire capital was holding its breath in preparation for this final farewell. When the procession finally began, James felt a profound shift in his understanding of his role and its significance. As he marched in formation alongside the Queen's coffin, he was acutely aware that he was not just participating in a ceremony, but in a moment that would forever mark the end of an era. The slow, measured pace of the procession allowed him to observe the faces in the crowd, and what he saw there was a mixture of grief, respect, gratitude, and love that was almost overwhelming in its intensity. The route took them past landmarks that had been significant throughout the Queen's reign. As they passed each location, James could see people pointing and whispering to their children about the historical significance of these places in the Queen's life. Parents were using this moment to teach their children about history, duty, and service, creating connections between past and future that would outlast the immediate grief of the moment. At Westminster Hall, where the Queen would lie in state for the next several days, James witnessed something that would forever change his perspective on his service. As the coffin was placed on the raised platform, where hundreds of thousands of people would come to pay their respects, he was selected to be part of the first vigil guard. This meant standing perfectly still at the corners of the coffin for 20-minute intervals, while a continuous stream of mourners filed past. The experience of standing vigil was unlike anything James had ever encountered in his military career. The absolute silence required, combined with the need for perfect posture and complete stillness, created a meditative state that allowed him to reflect deeply on the significance of the moment. But it was during one of these vigil periods that he made the gesture that would later be recognized as one of the most poignant yet overlooked moments of the entire mourning period. It happened during what was supposed to be a routine change of guard. As James prepared to step down from his vigil position, he noticed that his chinstrap had somehow worked loose during the 20-minute period of absolute stillness. Protocol demanded that his uniform be perfect at all times, especially during such a significant ceremony. But as he reached to adjust the strap, something made him pause. In that moment, James realized that adjusting his chinstrap would require a movement that might be seen as disrespectful during the solemn ceremony. Instead, he made a decision that came from deep within his understanding of service and respect. Rather than fixing the strap, he chose to leave his chinstrap down, slightly loosened, as a subtle but meaningful gesture of mourning. It was a small deviation from perfect protocol, but it was his way of expressing the grief that he couldn't show in any other way while on duty. The gesture was so subtle that none of the thousands of cameras positioned throughout Westminster Hall captured it. The media's focus was on the grand sweep of the ceremony, the famous faces among the mourners, and the overall spectacle of this historic moment. They missed the quiet act of a professional soldier who found a way to honor his grief while maintaining his duty. A perfect metaphor for the kind of service the Queen herself had embodied throughout her reign. As the days of lying in state continued, James rotated through various duties, sometimes standing vigil, sometimes managing crowd control, and sometimes serving in ceremonial capacities. Each role gave him different perspectives on how people were processing their grief and connection to the Queen. He saw world leaders standing humbly in line with ordinary citizens, all equal in their desire to pay their final respects. He witnessed families traveling hundreds of miles to participate in this moment of national mourning. The international response was extraordinary. James encountered people who had traveled from every corner of the Commonwealth and beyond, many of whom shared personal stories about how the Queen had touched their lives. Some had met her during royal visits to their countries, others had received honors from her, and many simply felt a connection to her as a symbol of stability and continuity in an uncertain world. During his breaks from duty, James found himself in quiet conversations with fellow guards about the significance of what they were experiencing. Many shared his sense that they were participating in something that transcended their normal duties. They weren't just following orders or maintaining traditions. They were helping to facilitate a process of collective healing and closure that was essential for the nation's emotional well-being. The night before the state funeral, James had a moment of profound realization about his chinstrap gesture. What had begun as an instinctive response to a uniform adjustment had evolved in his mind into something much more significant. That small act of imperfection in his otherwise flawless presentation had been his way of acknowledging that even those trained to show no emotion were deeply affected by this loss. It was a reminder that behind every uniform was a human being who understood the meaning of service and sacrifice. The state funeral itself was a masterpiece of organization and emotion. James's role placed him along the route to Westminster Abbey, where he had a clear view of the arriving dignitaries and the crowds that had gathered since the early morning hours. As the funeral service was broadcast to the watching world, he could see people in the crowd listening intently to every word, many wiping away tears as they said their final goodbye to a monarch who had been a constant presence in their lives. As the ceremonies concluded and the Queen was laid to rest, James reflected on the journey he had taken over the past week. He had begun as a ceremonial guard performing routine duties, but he was ending this period as someone who understood on a profound level what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. The Queen's example of lifelong dedication had been a masterclass in service, and her death had revealed to him the true meaning of his own calling. In the days that followed, as London slowly returned to normal and the crowds dispersed, James continued his duties with a renewed sense of purpose. His chinstrap gesture, unnoticed by the media and unknown to the public, remained his personal tribute to a queen who had shown him what a lifetime of service could accomplish. It was a small act, but it carried within it all the respect, grief, and dedication that he had felt during those extraordinary days. The media had captured the grand moments, the public tears, and the historic significance of the ceremonies, but they had missed the quiet gestures of those who served behind the scenes. James understood that this was as it should be. His role was not to be seen, but to serve. But in his heart, he knew that his loosened chinstrap had been as meaningful as any of the grand gestures that had made headlines around the world. Sometimes the most important acts of love and respect are the ones that go completely unnoticed, carried out by those who understand that true service requires no recognition, only commitment.